But having said that, hold on to your hats, because this is going to be something else. Peter is not known for being, well, he is known for being very controversial, and he's not going to change. He's talking about Mr. Trump, and I think we all know about Mr. Trump, so I'll just give it to Peter and go for it.
When I said I wouldn't be political, I only meant Australian politics, not the global politics. And although you're missing out on a speech about scamming, there is one scam I will be talking about. But I mainly come here to I've taken this opportunity to speak because the election of Trump in America is an earthquake that will affect not just America but the whole globe. As you probably all remember, an old saying that said, when America gets a cold, Australia gets pneumonia. What we have in Australia, it's very interesting that John spoke earlier about the appalling state of journalism in Australia. I think if you are only getting your information from the ABC, commercial TV, free-to-air channels, or the Age newspaper, then you're only getting half of what's going on. And I think what I really want to do today is to give you the other half so that you can make a decision about what is really going on. So I'll start with my view of Trump in his 2017, in his first presidency. I saw him as a corrupt businessman with no military or civilian experience in government and a past history of bankruptcies and divorces, and who lived on fast foods and coke. An ignorant president who refused to accept advice other than having it all in one sheet on his desk. And even then he didn't always read it. He spent his time watching TV and relying on his instincts. I thought he was a narcissist who embellished his own achievements, and the mainstream media kept account of what they called his bottomless Pinocchios, which were lies he repeated more than 20 times. And I was such a critic of Trump in that era that I was well known in my family. And my daughter-in-law, on one of her trips to America, gave me a gift of a battery operated toilet roll holder. And it was in our toilet for the next 6 months. And guests who we forgot to remind them would pull out their paper only to hear this voice say, "I'm going to make America great again. I am the greatest president ever seen." I will drink this lot. Anyway, once the January 6th uprising, as we say, I thought that was the end of Trump. But 8 months later, I've had a personal journey, and I need to speak about this only because this is where I changed. In September 2021, I could see COVID shots, in my mind, were not safe and effective. They were gene-altering drugs dressed up to look like vaccines, and they were not working against the Delta strain that we had in Australia at the time. And we already knew they were causing heart inflammation in young people. And given that we also knew that COVID was a disease of the very old and the very sick, with an overall mortality around 1%, and that Australian doctors have been banned from using effective treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And I felt at this point that it was absolutely against the code of ethics that I served under in the Hippocratic Oath to be giving an experimental drug to young people who had virtually no real risk of dying from the disease. I felt it also violated the Geneva Convention, the Nuremberg Code, and the basic rights of young teenagers. So I quit at that point, and then as I quit, I was then charged with undermining the national vaccine strategy and giving out COVID misinformation. When I actually responded to this charge, I sent the letter to AHPRA, the medical board, and sent copies to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, and the Royal College of GPs. And about my concerns, and not one of them addressed any of these problems. Now this really left me with a bit of an awkward situation, because it left me at odds with my profession, my government, and the religion I've been raised into. The Pope was in favour of COVID jabs and had actually issued a stamp to celebrate the COVID jabs. But what struck me most was that it wasn't just Australia. Every government worldwide seemed to move in a block to impose lockdowns, masks and experimental vaccines, despite no record of success in lockdowns and masks. Australia already had a pandemic plan drawn up during the Abbott era, which got shut down. The idea of a secret government operating to undermine the democratically elected government is not new. 40 years ago, yes, ministers, Sir Humphrey Appleby showed just how bureaucracy undermines anything. It's often said it was not just comedy, it was like a documentary. Names for the so-called secret government, we're into conspiracy theories here, of course, global elite, the deep state, the swamp, the blob, globalists, and the military-industrial complex. Now, because I'm talking about American politics, I want to quote 6 different presidents, because they gave me an idea of this idea of the secret government. The first was Abraham Lincoln, who said the money power of the bankers preys upon the nation in peacetime and conspires against it in adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, and more selfish than bureaucracy. Woodrow Wilson was quoted as saying, there is a power so organised, so subtle, watchful and interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that one better not speak above their breath when they condemn it. FDR said that the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, a financial element in the largest centres has owned the government since the days of Andrew Jackson. In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, it was planned that way. Harry Truman, I've taken them in order, Harry Truman said that I never would have agreed to the formation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, back in '47 if I'd known it would become the American Gestapo. And Ike Eisenhower, just as he was leaving at the end of his term, many of you will remember it, he gave this famous speech about the military-industrial complex. He said, until the latest of our world conflicts, the US had no armaments industry, but now we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Yet we must not fail to understand its grave implications. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. That was in January 1961. Only 3 months later, in April 1961, President Kennedy gave a speech to journalists at the Waldorf Astoria, and I've highlighted this of 2 paragraphs. Our way of life is under attack, yet no war has been declared, no borders have been crossed by marching troops, no missiles have been fired. No war ever posed a greater threat to our security. We are opposed by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its field of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. I suspect JFK's statements, as well as saying he wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces, may have had a bit to do with his being silenced. Certainly, Robert Kennedy's nephew, Bobby Kennedy Jr., believes that the CIA was involved in his uncle's, in his father's death, and in the death of Martin Luther King. But we'll soon find out because Trump's about to release them. So who makes up this deep state? At the top level, or this complex, at the top level there's a wealthy psychopathic elite who know what they're doing, and they're on a mission to control the world. The sort of people that make this up are global organisations like the United Nations and especially the World Health Organization. The US Federal Reserve and the banking industry as a whole, known to the freedom movement as banksters. The World Economic Forum, whose president has promised the mass of humanity that you will own nothing and be happy, and his spokesman Harari, who said man is a hackable animal. Their founder Klaus Schwab said his mission is to link humanity to AI, preferably via 5G and later 6G, with nanometals underneath the skin. Totalitarian leaders like President Xi, Kim Jong-un, and individuals like Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci. I mean, many of these leaders, even in their higher area, have had their loyalty bought with blackmail. Hence, there's a considerable interest in the Lolita Express to Epstein Island and these pays, and we'll hear more about that coming up too. So, but what makes it work is at the lower level, is at the bureaucrats, the politicians, and the leaders in medicine, science and courts, who genuinely believe they are doing the right things in protecting the world from threats of climate change and pandemics. So having read and done a bit of digging down this rabbit hole, I suddenly had a very different view of Trump because I had to discard what the press, what I understood, because I was only getting it from the media. Suddenly I saw Trump as a public figure as rather a giant in property development, including high-rise buildings, casinos and golf courses in the United States and across the globe. His TV program, The Apprentice, was highly successful for more than a decade. He was a single-figure golfer with an attractive wife and 5 children totally loyal to him. A genuine patriot who loved the USA and who drew large crowds to even with his long speeches. His unpopularity started when he entered politics. Not only was he not a member of the swamp, his campaign promised to drain it. Almost single-handedly, his MAGA movement had taken on the Republican and Democratic parties and won, because the deep state doesn't go for one party, it covers all of them, so that they win either whoever gets into parliament. Some of his bottomless Pinocchios then now seem to be true. I began to realise maybe it wasn't Trump that was telling the lies, it was the mainstream media. No wonder he called it fake news all the time. So perhaps he didn't read his briefs because he didn't trust the information he was getting. He had won the 2016 election with 69 million votes. In 2020 he got 74 million, he increased it by 5 million, yet Biden got 81 million, almost mainly postal votes, which was 16 more than Obama got at the height of his popularity. It wasn't that surprising that 71% of Republicans thought the election was stolen. So the moment Trump went into politics, suddenly from being a celebrity, he became the target for the media. And the campaign started from the word go. The Russian collusion campaign, along with the Steele dossier, both came from the Hillary Clinton camp. Both were later confirmed in the Durham report to have been fakes. They made 2 efforts to impeach him. The FBI was then used to say the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. The January 6th uprising, we'll hear a lot more about that now the Republicans are in control, because it very much looks like a sting. When that didn't finish him off, and he decided to stand again for the 2024, suddenly they found 91 charges in 5 different courts that have come to be known as lawfare. But to their horror, the deep state, with each charge, his popularity rose. People were waking up. Even when he was convicted, the polls refused to shift. Efforts to bankrupt him by demanding a massive fee for overestimating the value of Mar-a-Lago on a bank account, despite the bank being happy with the loan and being repaid in full. And when you think that they demanded all these tax returns and his business returns, and that's all they could come up with, it does suggest that he wasn't as corrupt as I thought he was. And only when these lawfare attempts failed did we get to assassination attempts. So really, in summary, there was incredible effort to get rid of Trump. And it all showed in the desperation to smear, ridicule, shame, punish, imprison and ultimately kill him. But what happened, the turning points in the US election is the debate provided the electorate with the undeniable evidence of Biden's cognitive impairment. Because all these electoral college votes and campaign money could only go to the vice president, they weren't able to elect a candidate they wanted, and they had to go to the vice president, who was already an unpopular candidate who spoke in word salads. But they certainly built her up very well with the media. The second turning point was Trump's defiant gesture after his near assassination, and I think his fist in the air underneath the stars and stripes is an image that will become almost as famous as the Iwo Jima thing. But the third one, the one that really did for me, and you won't have seen it unless you watch Sky News or you're getting alternative media, was the Democratic National Convention, which was, of course, on television everywhere, where there was towering eloquence from the Obamas, loads of celebrities, and everyone praising Kamala. And it was expected there would be a bump in the polls to add to it because she was already heading the polls at that time. But 2 hours later in Arizona, Trump held a rally with 20,000 people inside a stadium. And he announced that he was introducing a guest that you all will know and who is a truly great American. And he introduced when Bobby Kennedy came onto that stage, the place just erupted. And the sound of Bobby, Bobby, followed by the USA, USA. Carmel was cooked at that moment. He had 7 to 15% of the vote as an independent, which went across to Trump. Two other events that did help Trump was seeing him serving in knackers, which was a good contrast. And the other one, when Biden made the same mistake as Hillary. They always think Hillary lost the election because she described Trump voters as a bunch of deplorables. Biden went further and said they were garbage. So within 24 hours, Trump was dressed in his garbage gear with a garbage truck with Trump vents and giving an interview to all the press. So what can we expect, which is what I've mainly come here to talk to you about today, what can we expect from the 47th president? His acknowledged failure to drain the swamp as the 45th president, he's acknowledged that because the swamp was deeper than he realised and that some of his major appointments were swamp creatures. This time he's come prepared with a united and powerful team with people of talent, patriotism and integrity, and some of those have already been victims of the deep state, namely Bobby Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel and Joe Bhattacharya. And they've hit the ground running. Musk sent in the computer geeks to hack the computers as soon as they could, so hopefully before the criminal elements can delete or lose them. So the issues I know to discuss are the things that are going to be running against much of what we've been used to. The first one is freedom. And I want to say right from the start, freedom is something that is natural to us. You only watch a 2-year-old, they're very quick at saying no, and as soon as they can, they want to do their thing. The only way you can lose your freedom is by deception or force. And that's both been happening. While so many countries followed the USA in establishing democracy, the United States remains the only nation which has inscribed freedom in its constitution. In its First Amendment guarantees free speech as a gift from God, not something that governments can bestow or take away. In his inauguration address, Trump promised he would honour the Constitution and God, and he added practical decrees. Firstly, an end to censorship. Secondly, any government-sponsored institution that mandated vaccines would receive no money from the federal government. Thirdly, all military personnel who were discharged for not taking the COVID vaccine were to be reinstated with full back pay. The DOGE, which is the Department of Government Efficiency, headed by Elon Musk, is dedicated to free up money and free the government of corruption, fraud and inefficiency. In other words, bankrupt the swamp. And there's plenty of inefficiency and fraud, and we'll hear a lot. And probably if any of you saw the address to the Union address that Trump gave, he listed quite a few of them. And freedom from US debt, which is nearly 40 trillion, is essential to stop the country going bankrupt, which is where you really do lose your freedom. Caroline Leavitt, the new press secretary for Trump, has declared the Washington Post, New York Times, to CBS, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, Meta and Google to no longer have priority in the presidential briefing room. They have all lied to the American people about COVID, the Hunter Biden laptop and Biden's dementia. She has opened the room to representatives from alternative media like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. Next topic, climate change. Trump has described climate change as a hoax. He has made sure America has left the Paris Agreement. His pre-election mantra was drill, baby, drill. His goal was to make America an energy powerhouse, an exporter of energy with whatever sources of energy it has. He's not interested in building any more wind turbines, which he considers utterly ineffective and interfering with the life of whales and other native fauna. He wants to allow people to buy the cars of their choice, petrol or electric, and preferably made in the USA. Racial division. While the crime of slavery was overcome in the 19th century, racial inequality was rampant in the early and mid-20th century. While there is still some inequality, Trump sees the current racist issue as a globalist effort to divide and conquer by teaching white children to be ashamed of their colonial past and teach black children to feel aggrieved and angry about it. To help change this, he has ordered no federal funding to schools or universities that teach radical race theory. Appointing people to jobs based on DEI criteria with diversity, equity and inclusion is to be replaced by appointing people on merit only. And there will be pushback against huge companies like BlackRock that push ESG criteria, environmental, social and governance on corporations. And end of sexual division. He has declared that a Trump government will recognise only two genders, male and female. This will apply to women's toilets. It overrules Biden's rules which allow toilet use according to gender identity. It now reverts to gender according to whether you've got an XX or an XY chromosome. Women's sport will be limited to females only. Males who identify as women are banned as they have an unfair advantage in competition. When I wrote this, I said, currently this is before Congress. Could you believe that Congress rejected the bill yesterday when all 50 Democrat senators opposed the idea despite the fact that in polls only 18% of Americans agree with the idea of allowing males in female sport, or allowing trans in female sports. I want to have a quick word, because I said before, the union of Trump and Bobby Kennedy Jr. is a body blow to the global elite. A quick few words about Bobby. His uncle died when he was about 8 and his father when he was 14. He then became a heroin addict until he found his calling at 30. And I think his cousin, who was our ambassador recently, was pretty angry at Bobby because he misled some of the other members of the Kennedy clan on his drug dosing years. But when he got a job cleaning up the Hudson River at the age of 30, he turned cleaned his home life up. He said he attends AA or 12-step programs almost every day. He's as fit as we've ever seen him on, for somebody of 70, he looks like a bodybuilder. But while working with the cleaning up the Hudson, he started his own company, which he's had now for 40 years, cleaning up rivers, not only just in America but worldwide. In particular, at the time, the mercury level of fish in all the US rivers was too toxic to really eat any of the fish. And he found when he was doing this sort of work that it wasn't that the countries didn't have laws against pollution, it's just that they weren't being followed because of, I think he called corporate capture. The polluters infiltrated bodies that were meant to be supervising it and then relaxed the rules. What he did one day, he was giving talks on the mercury and he kept having these women sitting in the front row, and they come up to after him and saying, look, if you're going to really look at mercury poisoning, you need to look at childhood vaccines. And he didn't want to get into that area because it was absolutely such a political football. But eventually he was buttonholed by one woman who had a 16-year-old child who was still in nappies and at 16 after he had a childhood vaccine, and it was acknowledged as that, and she got 20 million and she had formed a society for the women who were the same group, and he went through all their notes and realised that what he was hearing from the CDC was very different to what he was hearing from them. And he set up the Children's Health Defence to try and protect children from these things. And in the process, he wrote The Real Fauci, which showed very clearly over about 900 pages, it sold over 1 million books, that Fauci had put the financial interests of the big pharmacy companies ahead of the people of America on almost every decision. He wasn't sued, which lets you know that what he was saying was probably true. So although Bobby Kennedy was vaccinated himself, his children all had their childhood vaccinations, he declared he was not against vaccination, he was not an anti-vaxxer as everybody said that he was. He just said that he wanted science to properly prove it, because he approached Fauci and said, where is the evidence that all these childhood vaccines have been compared with an inert placebo, like the sugar pill? And he never got any answers, so he eventually took him to court for freedom of information. And on the court steps, Fauci admitted they didn't have it. So at no stage has any of these childhood vaccinations been actually compared with true placebos, but only compared against previous vaccines. So no wonder they were a bit worried about him. The media certainly gave him no oxygen in his campaign as an independent. He wanted to stand as a Democrat, and the Democrats didn't want him. But linking his Make America Healthy again to Trump's Make America Great Again brought him publicity he could never have got otherwise. Now he's installed as the HHS Secretary, the supremo in charge of all health bureaucrats. He also wants to end the cosy arrangement between Big Pharma and the organisations that are meant to be protecting the community from the corrupt science. And interestingly enough, it's our own Australian journalist, Marianne Damasi, who did an independent survey of where do all the regulatory bodies in the Western world get their finances from, or what proportion of their budget is derived from pharmaceutical companies. Canada was 50%, the US FDA was 65%, Japan 85%, UK 86%, Europe 89%, and Australia tops the list. Our TGA gets 96% of its finances, from the pharmaceutical companies, the very companies they're meant to be policing. Makes it rather hard to refuse them, doesn't it? And that went into the British Medical Journal, one of the very few journals still left that's not owned by the deep state. Bobby Kennedy's approach through the election was a different approach to healthcare. So what he announced in his campaign speeches was that 2/3 of adults, this is for America only, 2/3 of adults and nearly half the children suffer chronic health issues. 60 years ago, less than 1% of children had a chronic illness. 74% of adults are overweight or obese, and close to 50% of children, compared with Japan's childhood obesity rate of 3%. 50% have diabetes or pre-diabetes. Almost 1/3 of kids are affected. Pediatric diabetes was a rarity in children 60 years ago. There's an explosion of neurological diseases that Kennedy never saw as a child. ADD, ADHD, speech delay, Tourette's, autism and Asperger's. In 2000, the autism rate was 1 in 1,500. Now it's 1 in 36 nationally and 1 in 22 in California. 18% of teenagers have fatty liver disease, a condition that used to be found only in late-stage alcoholics. 1 in 4 American women are on antidepressant medication. 40% of teens have a mental health diagnosis. 15% of high schoolers are on Adderall, it's an amphetamine used to treat ADHD. He put this disastrous health picture down to ultra-processed foods and toxic chemicals in food, medicines and environment. And many of these things, like Fruit Loops has got, in Europe has got 4 ingredients, in America it's got 11 by chemistry thing. Now, multiculturalism in the US. Trump has locked down the southern border and in the first month of office reduced illegal immigration by 94%, which stopped the gravy train of putting him up in comfortable hotels too and whatever. He has declared Mexican drug cartels as terrorists, allowing his military to fire on them. He is on the process of deporting illegal aliens, starting with the criminals, and he has the support of US citizens in doing so. He will still allow immigration, but they must fit into the US culture and not shout support for Hamas and Sharia law. In Trump's eyes, multiculturalism has only served to dilute and weaken the Judeo-Christian culture which was responsible for the success of Western civilization. As to relationships with other nations and countries, on trade he will be guided by the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He will apply tariffs on this basis. If a country has a 30% tariff on US goods, he'll apply a 30% tariff on their products. If they prefer free trade, he'll offer oblige, providing it works both ways. He seems to believe that God helps those who help themselves too when it comes to defence. Having told NATO countries to up their contribution in his first term, that seems to be working. We might have to lift our contribution here too, although fortunately Trump sees value in having allies in the South Pacific. Now, the hot button issue at the moment is the Ukraine-Russia war and the US involvement. The media would have you believe it was simply unprovoked aggression by Putin. Zelensky was a Churchillian-type hero, while Putin is the archetypal villain. Of course, this comic book picture is much more complex and actually has 2 sides. Only last week, the Doge discovered that the NSAID, which is not an aid organisation by the way, it's actually a slush fund for the CIA, and they had given $4 million to Time magazine to ensure Zelensky was their Man of the Year in 2022. But to give you a background to the situation, after Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to allow the East and West Germany to reunite, Gorbachev offered to remove 450,000 Soviet troops and leave the NATO troops in charge, which was a gutsy move, but only on condition that NATO would not move to the east beyond the German border. Only 5 years later, NATO, with US support under Clinton, started the process of incorporating 14 countries into NATO, taking it right up to Ukraine and the Russian border. Each country needed uniform arms, which only the US manufacturers could produce, which is pretty handy for the deep state. The US unilaterally withdrew from 2 anti-nuclear agreements with Russia and then placed missiles with nuclear capacity in Poland and Romania, like a gun to Putin's head. In 2014, USAID again spent $5 billion funding the Maidan Rebellion. It succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Ukraine, a government that favoured neutrality, and replacing it with one that favoured joining NATO. Victoria Nuland of the US State Department is on tape choosing the new cabinet for the incoming government 1 month before the coup. The new government of Ukraine then attacked the ethnic Russians of the Donbass, leading to a war which killed 14,000 ethnic Russians, a war that really still hasn't finished. Zelensky was elected on a peace platform to sign the Minsk Accords, but was pressured by the US to pivot away from it. However, when Putin sent 40,000 troops into Ukraine in February 2022, Zelensky, not being able to get US approval, managed to, by going through Israel and Turkey for mediation, managed to get signatures from France, Germany and Russia onto the Minsk Accords. However, Putin started removing his troops when Biden sent Boris Johnson to Kiev to scuttle the peace talks. Biden, in one interview, where he actually said the quiet bit out loud, as he often does. Biden has a habit of reading from the teleprompter and saying sit or whatever. And he said his purpose was regime change in Moscow. The war is now approaching 3 years. So peace, neither Europe nor US under Biden made any effort at peace. After the public display of disunity in the Oval Office last Friday, European and Australian leaders, along with the mainstream media, have backed Zelensky and offered him help. Trump was happy to show the world the truth on television. Zelensky wants to continue the war, but he doesn't have the cards. Zelensky went to Stalin, who promised support, but it was all words, and it had very little practical benefit. Trump then blocked all financial and military aid to Ukraine. Zelensky is now ready and eager to accept Trump's peace deal. Trump dictated a book called The Art of the Deal. I think you'll see it. Where will Trump go in the Middle East war? He showed in the first term he supported Israel, the only democratic country in the Middle East. He supported Jerusalem as the capital and achieved support for peace from Arab countries in the area. He has pushed for peace before his inauguration and achieved a POW swap that greatly favoured the Palestinians. He put his dream of the great Gaza as being sort of Gaza-Rama, whatever you call it, which everyone laughed about. But it has brought in the Arab countries looking to do the same thing, so something's happening. But he's very unimpressed with the barbarism showed by Hamas, especially returning the bodies of murdered children without the body of their mother, and has used the words all bets will be off if Hamas fails to honour the peace deal. He hasn't elaborated on that, but it won't be pleasant for the Palestinians and the governments they support. And just a little bit, a couple more, his dedication to peace. The US is in massive debt and can't afford to be involved in more costly wars, nor is the administration interested in propping up NATO when it endangers World War III and muzzles free speech. He certainly doesn't want to see continuing carnage like the World War I. But he's also aware, I think, of the danger of continuing warfare on the lives of military personnel, civilians and Americans in general. And there's one thing I just want to quote. This is the founding fathers of the United States understood this. Their Constitution and the Bill of Rights recognised that the greatest threat to the American people came from their own government. They gave special mention to the tendency for corrupt leaders to use war as a weapon. James Madison, a past president and one of the founding fathers, put it this way: of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies, debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in doling out offices, honours and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continued warfare, and yet the US has been waging wars almost continuously since entering the Second World War. And the final bit I want to talk about that's topical and is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is now rampant in the Western world. It has been justified as being anti-Israel, that they're a colonial power inflicting genocide on the Palestinians. Yet the protests started within hours of October the 7th and well before Israel had even started retaliation. And the demonstration outside the Opera House, where they were shouting gas to Jews, was on the 9th, only 2 days after. But it underpins basically, pogroms, which is a special word for persecution of Jews. That's been happening for 1600 years, mainly by Christians and Muslims. Yet both of these religions have Judaism at their base. Western culture is based on Judeo-Christian roots, the idea that humans are made in the image of God and deserve respect. Jesus added to that by telling us to love our enemies and turn the other cheek and forgive. But it's the reason that Western ethics and morality underlies the free world as compared to other totalitarian and other tyrannical regimes. The deeper cause of anti-Semitism, which I haven't got time to go into, but it lies in projection. Anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It lets us know the atmosphere is toxic. The freedom we've enjoyed in the West is based not just on rights, but on responsibilities. It's about following the 10 Commandments of Moses and being honest and respectful to each other. In his inauguration speech, JFK said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Perhaps too many Americans have forgotten that. The one who inspired the founding fathers of the US was William Penn, a Quaker and founder of Pennsylvania, and he said, "Men must be governed by God, or they'll be governed by tyrants." The US Bill of Rights is central to their constitution and mentions God 4 times. Hitler's tyranny started with the Jews as his scapegoat, and it led to all Germans and the whole of Western Europe falling under Nazi tyranny. Stalin also persecuted the Jews and went on to persecute just about everyone. The very existence of anti-Semitism in our Western societies is evidence we've lost the plot, we've lost our moral compass. It's a red flag that our own freedoms are in jeopardy. Trump recognises this. He concluded his inauguration speech by proclaiming his government would honour the Constitution and God. The Trump revolution is probably better regarded as a counter-revolution. He wants to take us back to common sense, truth in science and healthcare, and the ethics of our Judeo-Christian civilization. It doesn't mean everybody has to go back to religion. It does imply rediscovering a spiritual dimension. The qualities of God are what unite us, which is love and compassion, truth and freedom. The qualities that separate us are fear, lies, deceit, restriction and tyranny. Trump believes that this is what made America great, while Bobby Kennedy Jr. believes it's what made America healthy. Happy to take questions.